Hello and welcome to another episode of the Future of Transportation podcast hosted by Morpheus Meets. Today I have the pleasure of meeting and speaking with Dora Clarke, Head of Marketing Communications over at Osprey Charging Network. Hi Dora, how are you doing?
Hi Sam, good thanks.
Fantastic. And again, I had the pleasure of seeing you and hearing sort of you talk at the Fully Charged show, which seems now like a lifetime ago down in Farnborough.
It does. Yeah.
And I think there you were discussing sort of EV myth busting and sort of the sort of mythical and legendary sort of topics and conversations around around EV charging, EV cars as well. So we could certainly get into that, and that's what this episode is certainly about. But before we do that, I mean, what I should do with my guests is sort of get them to describe their journey into EV and the whole weird and wonderful world that it is. So if you don't mind, just give us a bit of a background. Listeners, a bit of a background there.
Of course, yeah, and thank you so much for having me. So I actually, weirdly, started my career in publishing, in books publishing, so really quite far away from all things EV. But I'd always wanted to work overseas, so I went to New Zealand in 2016 and worked for an energy company there in their comms department, and they were at that time trying to bring electric vehicles into their fleet. They had a huge renewable energy generation part of the business, so it made a lot of sense to then have electric vehicles. And as part of the comms team, we did a big campaign around how easy it was, although actually in reality it wasn't easy at all, to drive and charge throughout New Zealand. So that really got me into EVs at quite an early stage, I suppose, driving them, charging them, learning all about that. And when I came back to the UK, I was really keen to stay in the industry. So got a job at a very, very small business then called Ingenie, who were installing rapid chargers. And over time, that business obviously has grown into Osprey Charging Network, which is where I'm head of marketing now. So it's an incredible kind of growth journey over the past 5 years, and a very interesting, from a marketing perspective, very interesting brand journey as well for the business. Yeah.
Fantastic. And now sort of in Osprey, sort of one of the largest sort of UK based charging networks, and sort of heading up absolutely, and heading up sort of the Charged UK conglomerate as well, which is an exciting sort of step. I mean, is there anything you could say a little bit about that, perhaps?
Yeah, so I think Charge UK is incredibly important because it gives a voice to the rapid charging industry, and I think to date there's been trade bodies who represent electric vehicles and charging, but with a lot of pressure on the public charging networks to deliver the infrastructure that the UK needs. I think that coming together as that industry and actually kind of finding common points of maybe it's a barrier to installing more charge points, maybe it's something that could help us all, whether it's government or other parts of the kind of deployment process. That's just been a very, very useful exercise, and hopefully we'll make sure that we can all install as fast as we'd like to. Yeah,
absolutely. So just out of interest, what are the challenges that group is sort of set up to tackle, if you like?
So it's really interesting because there's a huge amount of investment into all these businesses, so private investment that means that we have large numbers of charge points ready to either installed already in the ground, or they're ready to be deployed with landlord partners or sometimes on owned land. And it's actually the processes and the personnel in government bodies, or sometimes bodies like local authorities and highways and planning departments, and the lack of resource and in those places has made it very difficult to kind of get projects through as quickly as we would like to. And I'm sure as everyone would like to, but obviously there is just this, a kind of, a nationwide lack of resource in those parts of the process. And it has just been a lot slower, especially things as simple as, the distribution network operator being able to come and just flick a switch, turn on the site, get it live. That's caused a lot of delays for projects for lots of the rapid charging network. So it's working really with the parts of government who can sort of influence that, but also working with those bodies who have the power to affect that as well. So getting more projects in the ground faster.
And I guess that leads us on to sort of one of the points I think you touched on in your myth busting talk as well, is sort of, and something we discussed before coming onto this podcast is, the optimum amount of charging points, that magic number, sort of what is.
And that's such an interesting, it makes sense. I think everyone would love to have some target number that they work towards, and then you can see how much progress you're making, and we can all feel like we're pulling in the same direction. That would be lovely. But I think it's a complete myth. I mean, the number that is out there is 300,000 public chargers. That is not just rapid. That includes obviously all your slows and your somewhere between slow and rapid, fast, and so it's quite difficult really, because actually the types of charging that's needed for people in different types of housing, different types of use of their car, different types of journey, that is a different type of charging infrastructure. And you find that, for example, people talk a lot about how London is incredibly over-provisioned. There's so many chargers. Why are there so many chargers? London always gets all the best stuff. But actually, London has a lot of people in flats and a lot of terraced housing. And so, that there is a need for more chargers for those people. But equally, and this is really, I find this really interesting, right? So you can make that argument, you don't need as many in the rural areas because people have off-street parking. But actually, people in rural areas drive way more and further mileage, up to 40% more miles per year than their urban counterparts. So maybe they do need more, but in a different way. So they probably need those en route, longer journey, quick recharges. And then the people in the urban centres will need the on street, slower, effectively replacing your home charger type charging. And so because of that, those sorts of discrepancies, it's just impossible to kind of say there's this number for such a range of different types of charger.
Yeah, absolutely. And I had an interesting conversation with Ben Whittaker actually over at Kerbo Charge, almost with this sort of similar topic. Is rapid charging or fast charging the charge choice of last resort in a way. So in an ideal world, everyone be having sort of an on street or at home charge point, because the majority of the trips we do are sort of 5-10 minutes to the shops or short distance. Obviously, you mentioned rural based
do drive further, but you're right. The majority of journeys can completely be covered by home charging, and so actually, it's that also kind of. I think there's also this myth around the number of EVs being registered is far faster than the growth of public charging, but obviously, 80-ish% of that EV's charging will be done at home. So you don't need another charger per every sort of electric vehicle that goes in, because that's by home charging.
Yeah, and I guess that brings us on to the topic of cost and energy and things like that. And just before we jumped on, you mentioned sort of it's hard to sort of pin down an actual stat because energy at the moment is changing so quickly. So how does that affect people when they choosing to come into this EV world?
Yeah, and I think you're completely right. It's been quite difficult recently, and it has been less of a easy choice than it maybe was a couple of years ago, where home energy especially was incredibly cheap, especially if you had an off-peak rate, and you could be running your EV on as little as sort of 2p per mile if you charged mostly at home, and that is obviously incredibly cheap versus a petrol diesel car being, I think at the time, was probably around 20p per mile. Obviously, we've had quite an unusual 12 months in terms of energy prices, both at home, but then that also translates into public charging costs as well. And so you find now people hear a lot of this rhetoric that if you use a public charger, it's more expensive, just as expensive as petrol or diesel. And that's obviously a very negative and off-putting message to hear, because you're thinking, well, hang on, why I would have to pay more for the car up front most of the time. There's a lot less second-hand market options. So this take that cost is there's a big what's taken away is one of the biggest incentives for switching. And so I think this moment in time, it is hard to make the argument about cost. However, I would still say it is still cheaper because you're not always going to charge on a public rapid charger. You're just not. So you're completely right. It is a really difficult time to assess the costs of owning an EV because we have been through 12 months of quite turbulent electricity prices, both at home and therefore on the public network as well. And I think that can really create confusion for people. They've heard it's a lot cheaper to drive an electric vehicle, but then they also hear that on the public network, if you rapid charge, it's just as expensive, if not more, than petrol and diesel. And that can be really off-putting for people. So I think what I would say as a mythbuster is that it is still, in the absolute majority of cases, still cheaper to run because you are going to be either charging at home on there's so many off-peak rates available out there from electricity providers, or you're going to be on a slower, maybe workplace or a street charger, which is cheaper. And so your cost per mile from those is a lot less than petrol and diesel. It's probably more like 3 to 6p. And then, as you said, when you do need that rapid charge, it's a bit like a takeaway coffee. You're going to pay more for it because it's a moment of need and it gets you to the next part of your journey. So, I think the other part that's hard for people is that the second-hand market for electric vehicles hasn't perhaps taken off as much as people were expecting, which is where you can get a cheaper car. But what I would say is that there's an incredible range of options for leasing, for subscribing to cars, which is quite like a lot broader than you can get for petrol and diesel. So some really cool kind of subscription models, which might include charging, which will have discounts, bundles and things, maybe on home energy as well. So that's a really good way to go.
Absolutely. And when it comes to sort of upkeep as well of an EV, I think you mentioned that's slightly cheaper too. Do you mind just explaining a little bit more around that?
Yeah, completely. So so an electric vehicle has less than 10 moving parts, which makes it very easy to maintain because there's a lot less to go wrong. That just it makes it cheaper from a kind of repair maintenance perspective, but there's also other cost savings that go with EVs. So things like you don't have to pay ULEZ chargers, or in some boroughs, things like sort of congestion charges or parking can be cheaper, and there's no road tax as well. So it is still nicely incentivized to drive electric.
Absolutely. And I think on that topic of energy as well, I think energy providers, they've been doing tariffs for a long time with sort of businesses in a more commercial setting as well. But I think it's starting to creep into more domestic settings when it comes to charging and things like that. Feel free to explain a little bit around sort of how that works and what that might look like.
Yeah, absolutely. So the overnight tariff is the sort of traditional one, and actually it's been around for a long time with the people who have an economy 7 meters, so it's a cheaper rate overnight. But for electric vehicles more specifically, what they usually do is give you maybe a 4-hour, maybe a 6-hour period where it is really cheap. And with pretty much every home charger now that you can buy, you can schedule that home charger to charge the car during those hours. So you might plug it in when you get home, but you would not, the charge would not start flowing until it's cheaper on that nightly rate. And that's where you really can get some brilliant rates where you're looking at more like that kind of 2-3 per mile, p per mile cost.
I spoke to sort of commentator over the German market as well, and apparently there recently they were in sort of negative sort of pay, if you like, for a very simplified term, but effectively they were being paid for like cent, a kilowatt or something like that overnight, which is I guess the holy grail in terms of sort of the efficient charging tariffs. But obviously, I think that's something maybe that sort of very quickly we'll see in the UK market as well, and coming in, especially as we're leaning more toward renewable source of energy as well.
Exactly, and I think that that dynamic of having a whole, maybe not a whole population, but a large population of effectively batteries sitting on the driveways of people's houses, that is quite an exciting prospect for how energy is managed and stored. I think we're a little bit way off it still, but it still excites me. It still makes me excited about that. Yeah,
exactly. It's definitely sort of an up and coming thing. And certainly a conversation for myths and legends and dreams at the moment.
Yeah, exactly.
I think another one of those as well is the sort of vehicle to grid charging as well. Effectively having your car as a outdoor or external sort of generator to your home as well, powering when energy costs are high. Actually, instead of charging into the car, it's putting energy into the domestic environment. Watch TV, cook dinner. You could effectively do that on your car batteries, because they're effectively, I think they're more powerful. They store more energy than your average sort of external battery cell you can buy for your house.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, interestingly, I'm sure we'll come on to battery recycling, but one of the ways that you can recycle a car battery is as home storage. So, yeah, definitely.
Well, and this kind of takes me on to the topic of, you mentioned sort of second-hand cars and second-hand vehicles and that market not really taken off. But I feel like the way maybe sort of we should be looking at EVs, for example, is almost like a second life market, because there's a lot more applications than just sort of buying a second-hand car, because effectively the battery will outlive the vehicle itself. So in terms of applications, there's either sort of that second-hand market, there's battery energy storage units where batteries can be taken out of cars and into the storage grid, and obviously that recycling topic as well. But I mean, just on that point of second life, I mean, what are because this is relatively unknown to the masses at the moment, sort of what this may look like. I mean, what may it look like?
I think it's a really good question, because I think one of the big myths is around battery recycling, and the quite right concern that we're producing large batteries for cars, and what happens to those afterwards. And I guess the first thing to sort of help dispel that myth is that the EU regulations around batteries means that no battery is going to end up at landfill. So that's just, you can't do that. The manufacturers have to take them back. And as you say, there's some really interesting projects where, for example, those batteries that are finished in the car can go back to factories where they make the car and help to store energy from, say, wind or solar to power the factory where the car is then made again. So I think it's an interesting life cycle, because obviously, like, it is post-car still a battery, really useful as a battery, lots of mileage as a battery. And then even after that, the components within that battery can be recycled and brought back around to go into new batteries. And I think that's something that I'd like to touch on, because the car batteries have shone a light, I think, on the whole battery manufacturing and recycling industry, or journey as a whole. And every day we're using phones, we're using laptops, we're using all sorts of electrical items that have batteries in them. And it's only really with the advent of electric vehicles and sort of collective mind being focused on actually what are we doing with all these batteries, not just recycling, but also where do the lithium and the cobalt, where does that come from? And how do we kind of ensure that there's enough of it, but also that at the end of the battery's life, we can get the important parts of the battery back out to come around again. So I think whilst it seems to be quite a big argument when people are against electric vehicles to say, but the batteries, I'd like to point out that the battery industry has had the electric vehicle industry has really kind of helped to and should help to improve the sustainability of that whole process over time, because there's been a need to recycle and to ensure the responsible disposal or recycling of those elements.
Yeah, and again, I think this is a big part of the whole life cycle. I think the average person will go in and buy a electric vehicle, thinking, I'm driving, around in a very clean vehicle and doing my part for the environment. You are, a lot of people, what they don't see is the mining of the materials, the sort of recycling, albeit that's still a very sort of industry, but I guess there is sort of an ethical sustainability topic as well to touch on here too.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because if you look at something like cobalt, which is used in electric vehicle batteries, the amount of cobalt that's used in petrol refinery, that industry, is far, far greater than for electric. The amount of cobalt that's used in petrol refining is far, far more than is used to make batteries for electric vehicles. And yet, to this date, we have never had a problem with the use of cobalt in petrol refinery, and therefore in petrol and diesel vehicles. So I think it is an interesting one. There is still, and there is obviously problems with some of the ways in which some of those elements are mined and the places that they're mined and the ethical and sustainable practices that go on there. However, that focus, again, that sort of focus from the electric vehicle industry on supply chains, sustainability of those supply chains, but also the ethics and the kind of, again, shining that light on the practices that's come because of the scrutiny that electric vehicles have been under, has actually improved the supply chain more widely. So those mines don't just produce those metals and cobalt or lithium for electric vehicles, they're producing it for all the batteries, including everything that we're all using, regardless of the car we drive. So I think it's overall, obviously there's a long way to go, but it is at least a much more visible and much more concerted effort to improve those elements.
Absolutely. I think, and I'm touching on sort of recycling as well, sort of as a last point, I guess, is I think that's the last piece of the puzzle, really, for it to be a circular economy. Because at the moment, I think, batteries or the materials are mined in sort of remote locations in Asia, Africa, Australia, and then shipped to the manufacturing sites. The cars are shipped to sort of dealerships or customer, and then at the end of life shipped back to be recycled. Now, I know of several companies, especially in Europe, trying to really sort of accelerate their recycling capabilities. But what would that bring to when we crack it? If we crack it, what will that bring to the whole sort of circular economy and the EV environment as a whole?
I think there was an interesting slide I've just seen. This is obviously a little bit biased because it's Tesla's impact report, but Tesla had a really interesting graphic which basically showed in a pictorial form, in the form of tiny little mining trucks, the amount of mining that goes on for the current economy that we have, which is based on still, consuming a lot of fossil fuels. So whether it's petrol in your car or gas or otherwise, it's a lot of fossil fuels. Whereas if you're moving to a economy based far more on electricity and batteries and renewable energy, that still requires mining. But because of the nature of batteries, the fact that you can recycle those elements, you don't just burn stuff and then it's gone. You are mining still, but you're mining something that can be reused round and round. And I think the estimate last year was that the current capacity for mining will be able to produce enough of those elements for electric vehicles right up to 2050, which obviously seems like quite a decent chunk of time. There will be, of course, that will come quicker than we think, and there will be then a need to kind of maybe expand a little bit in terms of the mining capabilities. But actually, as you've said, and as is the great thing about batteries, they're much, much more circular just by the nature of the type of material they are. So once those materials have made it from out of the earth and into the manufacturing plants, and as those regulations and that pressure to find the best ways to make that process efficient, to make sure that we're getting the most out of those elements and all the way through, and the background and all the way through again, I think there's as Tesla's lovely graphic showed, your total little mining trucks shrinks quite considerably because you can recycle just by dint of the material itself being so much more recyclable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a form of recycling, direct recycling as well, which effectively takes a battery, or you can create a battery from a battery. So once this material is out of the ground, I mean, it's not like petrol or like you said, it just burns away. All of the materials are still stored in the battery. It just needs re-energizing the sort of electrodes. I'm not a scientist. I'm not going to claim to be, but effectively, you can take that material and create another battery as well. And we touched upon the second life as well. You're not just taking this out of the ground to just make an EV battery or a battery to put into an EV. This will then have a second life, potentially even a third life. And then sort of be recycled into more batteries. So
yeah.
I think this is a really nice myth, perhaps. to
It is, yeah. I think the recycling one is a big one, and I think it's the reason it's such a good myth is because right now, as we've said, that recycling industry is still in its early stages. It's not super visible, like it's not something that people know a huge amount about. So it's easy to be like, I don't know about that. I've never seen batteries be recycled. I don't see banks of secondhand EV batteries on the walls of factories and things. It's quite it is still early days, but I'm totally confident, especially with the regulation, with the the manufacturers. It makes a lot of sense for them to do it as well, economically. That there is, I'm confident that it will happen, and that certainly even now. I think the best thing to say to people is right now, no battery is going to landfill. No battery is going to be burnt up in a incinerator because already those regulations are in place. So.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, I think that's all we have time for today, Dora. But it's been fantastic having you on the podcast as well, and I hope to have you on in a future episode as well. But thank you very much for your time.
That's quite all right. Lovely to speak to you.
Likewise. Take care.